welcome back to EDH Deck Building. I am your host, Demo, and it's time for another Magic Rules video. This series started out with me reading the comments of my videos and seeing some fallacies. People were making some incorrect assumptions about Magic rules. Yes, it can be very complicated. We do get it wrong from time to time. And I was just correcting those people in videos to give everyone else those insights as well. And now this series has essentially become just answering the Magic rules questions of my viewers. So let's get right to it. A few months ago, I had a game where my friend cast Scab Clan Giant, which randomly targeted a creature I controlled with hexproof. Additionally, there were other legal targets on the battlefield. I tried finding rules for this online, but because time constraints, we just let it go. How does this ruling work? Let's take a look at Scab Clan Giant. 4 red and a green, Giant Warrior 4/5. When it enters the battlefield, it fights target creature an opponent controls, chosen at random. And of course, hexproof means it can't be. And in fact, if we read the actual wording, can't be the target of abilities your opponents control. And as I have said in previous rules videos, can't always trumps everything else. If a card says can't, that means you cannot do it. So when you have your Scab Clan Giant enter the battlefield, well, what you're going to do is you're going to choose all the legal targets for that ability and then choose one at random, right? So you got to start there. That's the issue that your playgroup had. When the Scab Clan Giant comes down, how many creatures are there in play? Start with that. Obviously, those are the legal targets because obviously you have to target a creature, but then you have to pick a creature that can be targeted. In fact, I have a Shanna deck, and a very undervalued ability on there, which has come in handy a few times, is Shanna can't be the target of abilities your opponents control. That's not even hexproof, but it does work against that Scab Clan Giant. Your Scab Clan Giant cannot fight my Shanna because it is not able to be targeted by that ability. So when this creature comes down, you look at all the legal targets for it, and then you roll a dice or whatever method you're using for picking it at random, right? Any illegal target is not included in there, right? So you can't do it. Let's move on. Question about Elesh Norn, the Argent Etchings. When it flips to the enchantment side, does it still count as your commander for the purposes of, for example, casting Flawless Maneuver? And of course, the easy answer here is yes, absolutely it does. You can go check out my commander damage video where I go into that quite a bit about what your commander actually is. That physical card is your commander. And obviously Flawless Maneuver wants you to control your commander. If you control your commander, you may cast a spell without paying its mana cost, so absolutely it would be free. Your commander is whatever that piece of cardboard is in the command zone when the game starts. As I talked about in the commander damage video, even if you have a background, that background is your commander, and if you can animate it by turning it into a creature, it will indeed do combat damage because it is one of your commanders, right? So yes, at no point does that piece of cardboard stop being your commander. Your opponent casts a Song of Dryads on it, turns it into a forest. It is still your commander, even though it is just a forest land. All right, this is going to be a stupid question, but I will ask it anyways. Good for you, buddy. If the only legal target for a tap target artifact is a Torpor Orb or a Lightning Greaves or some other artifact without a mana ability, what do I do? The quick answer here is you tap it, right? And in fact, a lot of people will tap down their artifacts for an improvised type of ability. Equipment is great for that, of course, because whether your equipment is tapped or not, it doesn't mean anything. It's still equipped to that creature. It doesn't change anything that the equipment is doing. But before I continue, let's finish the question. And also, can artifacts and enchantments without tap abilities be tapped or untapped in the first place? For example, Meraxis of Keld has power and toughness each equal to the total number of untapped artifacts, creatures, and lands I control. If I have him 6 untapped mountains and a Darksteel relic in play, will his power be 7 or 6? So there is a simple answer to this question, but I want to talk about a bunch of stuff here because it's an interesting one. And I always like to bring up Winter Orb as an example here. This is a perfect example of what he's talking about in this question, but also how the game used to get played, right? So Winter Orb is a 2-mana artifact. As long as Winter Orb is untapped, players can't untap more than 1 land during their untap steps. So of course, if you tap down the Winter Orb, it shuts off this ability. So there is a perfect example of an artifact without a tap ability that actually wants to be tapped for a very specific reason, actually references it on the card. And the reason it references it is because that's how the game used to be played back in the day. If you look at the original Winter Orb, players can untap only one land during untap phase. Creatures and artifacts are untapped as normal. So of course, funny wording, but the most important part being that there's nothing on there that says if it's untapped, right? So the original Winter Orb didn't say anything about being untapped. Well, why did they throw that on the new version? And the reason why is because that's the way the rules used to work. It used to be in the game of Magic, if you tapped something, it shut it off. In particular, artifacts, right? So when Winter Orb was actually used in the game, people were tapping it down to shut it off. But then when they changed the rules, of course, you couldn't do that anymore. So they errated Winter Orb to include basically the old way of how people used to play with Winter Orb. There are other artifacts that do this as well, like Howling Mine, right? Because that's the way the game used to be played. So it is very significant, in fact, to be tapping artifacts sometimes and enchantments as well. And if you go look at one of my favorite sets, Future Sight, some of the goofiest cards you've ever seen, it actually has enchantments that tap. Flowstone Embrace, for example, 1 in a red, enchantment aura, enchant creature. You tap it to give enchanted creature +2, -2 until end of turn. So of course, that has nothing to do with the creature tapping or untapping, right? People might look at this and think, okay, well, I tap the enchanted creature to give my... No. The creature doesn't have to tap to use this ability. This is the actual aura that is tapping to give the enchanted creature that ability. Second Wind, even more the case. 2 in a blue enchantment aura, enchant creature. You tap the aura to tap enchanted creature, and you tap the aura to untap enchanted creature. This is such a goofy card and can be kind of confusing for especially a new Magic player when you're looking at it, but you are actually tapping the aura in order to use those abilities. Those abilities are not on the creature, they're on the enchantment. So you can absolutely tap enchantments, although it certainly is rare. So we go look at Meraxis of Keld, and I really hope you actually have a Meraxis of Keld commander deck. I did it on my Underwhelming Commander series. It certainly is a unique commander with very unique art. That guy looks like a real badass. So it says Meraxis of Keld's power and toughness are each equal to the number of untapped artifact creatures and lands you control. That's it. There is no, well, what if this artifact taps or what if this? No. It doesn't care about any of that. All this card cares about is count the number of artifacts, creatures, and lands you have in play that are not tapped. That is all. So it absolutely includes that Darksteel Relic. Player A steals all of Player B's creatures. Some of those creatures have damage triggers. Player A attacks and kills Player B with those creatures. State-based action, that player dies and leaves the game along with their creatures. Does Player A still get the damage triggers from Player B's creatures, or do those creatures get booted with that player that owned them? Great question. I believe I covered the whole state-based action thing in a previous video. This literally just came up in a game I was doing on my Patreon a couple of weeks ago, and we had to cover this issue. Let's look at Cold-Eyed Selkie, one of the best damage trigger cards out there. Says, whenever Cold-Eyed Selkie deals combat damage to a player, you may draw that many cards. So for ease of the example that I'm giving here, let's pretend my opponent only has 1 life left. I steal my opponent's Cold-Eyed Selkie with my Act of Treason, something like that, right? I gain control of it, and then I attack them with it. Of course, they only got 1 life, and they also have islands, so they can't block it because it has Island Walk. We go to the combat damage step, and they are taking 1 damage, which of course reduces their life to 0, which of course is going to kill them. State-based actions happen whenever someone gains priority, so the damage happens all at once, as I talk about in my combat damage video. Again, that's a very important video to check out if you're confused about any of this stuff. Damage happens all at once, then state-based actions happen when any player could gain priority. So essentially, as soon as all the damage is done, that player is now reduced to 0, which means they're out of the game. And of course, their creature is also out of the game. You are correct in that assumption. That creature is now gone. However, the damage did happen, so that ability did trigger, and that ability did go on the stack. Now, as I talked about in a video previously with Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts, whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, destroy that creature. So if I'm killing a person who has a Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts in play, their commander will trigger. However, now they're out of the game, and once someone someone's out of the game, all of their abilities, all their spells, everything that is attached to them will disappear. Their abilities that have triggered and gone on the stack will vanish, so none of my creatures will get destroyed. However, it is different here because I controlled this creature, right? So control of the permanent is what matters here, not necessarily owning it. Yes, they own this card and it will be removed from the game, but the ability is actually mine. That's my ability that's on the stack because I controlled the creature when it dealt damage. So yes, when the person is reduced to 0 health, they will be removed from the game and the Cold-Eyed Selkie will be removed from the game. But as I have stated so many times and is the most viewed video on my entire channel, removing the source of an ability does not get rid of the ability. So the fact that the Cold-Eyed Selkie's gone doesn't mean that the ability goes away. That ability of dealing combat damage to draw a card still is on the stack and is controlled by me, not the player that was removed from the game. So they will be gone and then I will get to draw my card. You still get all your damage triggers as long as you're still in the game. Let's end off with kind of similar to the play versus cast question. Is there a way to determine when play lets you ignore timing restrictions? The example in my head is Djinn of Wishes. The Gatherer entry states this ability lets you ignore timing restrictions, whereas cards with impulse draw effects don't. Is there some form of language used to differentiate these abilities? Is there? Yeah, sort of. I mean, this is kind of a tough one, honestly. And I guess the language used is the best way to know. So if we look at Djinn of Wishes, pay 2 blue, remove a wish counter from Djinn of Wishes, reveal the top card of your library. You may play that card without paying its mana cost if you don't exile it. So the wording that we don't see there, of course, is the wording that we typically see on impulse draw, which is you may play that card this turn, or you may play that card until the beginning of the next end step, or you may play that card, fill in the blank with a time limit on where you can play that card. I think the wording or the language you're looking for is there a time limit in which I can play the card? If there is no time limit at all, then that means I get to play the card right away. Madness being the best example of this. We look at Alms of the Vein, 2 and a black, sorcery. Target opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. So of course, typically we would have to cast this at sorcery speed, but it has Madness, 1 black. If you discarded this card, so of course I'm playing my Angie Falconrath deck, I'm going to use her ability to discard this at instant speed. I discard it into exile, and when you do, cast it for its Madness cost or put it into your graveyard. So it's telling you to cast it immediately, right? There is no timing restriction there because it doesn't tell you that there's a time in which you need to cast it. So for me, a card that breaks timing restriction is one that doesn't give you any other options to do so. If we look at Praetor's Grasp, right? Search target opponent's library for a card and exile it face down. Then that player shuffles. You may look at that card and play it for as long as it remains exiled, right? So now we have some wording in there that gives you a time frame in which you can cast it. If this card said you may look at that card and you may play it without the as long as it remains exiled stuff, that would mean you would have to do it right away, which means you could break the timing restrictions there. That is how I believe it works. I might not be 100% right here, but as far as I know, if you're given an option to cast it at any time, then you would have to follow normal timing restrictions. If it says until end of turn or until your next turn, that kind of stuff means you got to follow the normal timing restrictions, but obviously there's a lot of ways that you don't have to. That is my best answer for that question. Let me know in the comments if I am incorrect, and let me know in the comments if you have any other burning rules questions that I could tackle on this series. That is it for today though, and thanks for tuning in.